A couple weeks ago, I talked about some of the greatest American gimmicks of all time. The characters in wrestling who were built up as heroes, defending our nation from the worst thing of all, people who aren't from here. The hatred and fear of the other coming to destroy everything we hold sacred is one of mankind's most base fears, and though the subjects of that hatred and fear have changed over time, it's one that holds true to this day. Leave it to pro wrestling to capitalize on our most primal prejudices, exploiting wars, various foreign conflicts, and in some cases just stoking plain old racism to get the fans riled up in the pursuit of the almighty dollar. Which isn't to say that it hasn't been successful. Many of wrestling's greatest heels have been born from this sort of exploitation. And this week, I'm gonna rank them, my top 8 picks for the greatest foreign wrestling heels of all time. Number 8, the Fabulous RJO Brothers. When the World Wrestling Federation began their major expansion in the 1980s, it wasn't just the American territories that got snuffed out. Johnny Rougeau's Lutte Internationale out of Montreal was eventually swallowed whole by the Federation, but at least the WWF offered jobs to its top stars in Rick Martel, Dino Bravo, and the promoter's own sons, Jacques and Raymond Rougeau. While the Rougeaus were superstars in their native Quebec, in the WWF they were seen as this run-of-the-mill mid-card babyface tag team. Nobody knew why the Rougeaus were fabulous in the first place. They didn't even have cool masks like the Killer Bees. But in the summer of '88, the slow burn of the Rougeaus' heel turn began when they started showing a little too much love for the United States, waving around the tiniest flags possible and announcing their intentions to move to the USA and become citizens. Jacques and Raymond soon announced Jimmy Hart as their new manager, who helped them find new residents in Memphis, Tennessee. The Mouth of the South revealed that he still held the rights to the contracts of his former clients in the Hart Foundation and skimmed some of their earnings to help the Rougeaus move to the States. I mean, you couldn't even throw Bret and Anvil some pizza for agreeing to help unload the moving truck? Then came the final glorious insult, their entrance theme, one of Jimmy Hart's greatest arrangements to ever grace our ears. When I first heard this song, I thought it was some of the corniest stuff imaginable. But as my tastes have grown and become more mature and sophisticated, I find that this song actually kicks all kinds of ass because of its corniness. The tongue-firmly-in-cheek disingenuousness from the Rougeaus as they enthusiastically and tone-deafly sing about their supposed love for America makes this song one for the ages. And lest we forget Jacques' further contribution to wrestling lore after the Rougeaus split, when he was repackaged as one of Canada's most recognizable symbols, the Mountie. Number 7, Team Canada and the UnAmericans. If I can be serious for a minute, you know you're a good foreign heel and you can do basically the same shtick across multiple companies and get it over each time. One of the best talents in ECW's heyday, it was no surprise that Lance Storm would eventually get scooped up by a larger company, and in the summer of 2000, it was WCW who grabbed the man from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Storm was bolted to the upper echelon of WCW, winning the finals of the US Championship Tournament in a match with Mike Awesome 1 month after his debut. Then a rematch took place the following month at New Blood Rising, a game of heel Calvin Ball, if you will. The aforementioned Jacques Rougeau came in as the guest referee and constantly changed the rules to keep Mike Awesome from winning. Despite the obvious heat-seeking formula for Storm, it went over like Rover for the audience in British Columbia. Storm had one of the most rapid pushes in WCW history, winning the US, Hardcore, and Cruiserweight titles in quick succession, then putting his own Canadian stamp of disapproval onto all of them, renaming them the Canadian title, the Saskatchewan Hardcore International title, or shit, lol, get it? And the 100 kilos or under title. Ooh, if there's one thing that we Americans hate more than folks from other countries, it's the metric system. Storm formed Team Canada alongside Elix Skipper and Carl Ouellette. Then the group started to get a little out there when they brought Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Major Guns, and even former rival Mike Awesome into the fold. The group would be around in some form or fashion right until the end, though nothing would ever top that sweet summer of 2000 for Lance and WCW. Oh, and by the way, shout out to TNA's version of Team Canada, led by Coach Scott D'Amore. I tell you, if it wasn't Jeff Jarrett's theme we got sick of hearing every week, it was these guys. When Storm fired the first shot of the WCW invasion in 2001, who would have guessed that he would once again find himself challenging American ideals? heels. After the brand split the following year, Storm and fellow Canadians Christian and Test joined forces on SmackDown to become the UnAmericans. The faction quickly established itself as a force to be reckoned with when they beat Hulk Hogan and Edge for the tag titles at Vengeance 2002, taking the belts with them to Raw. The Baddies immediately caused a ruckus on the Red Show when they attempted to set fire to the American flag before being stopped by a group of babyfaces. The group continued to pick up steam in the fall as William Regal joined the faction, but the anti-American experiment was already coming to an end. The story goes that everyone in the group except for Regal were unable to handle the heat from angry fans in this post-9/11 landscape, though Lance Storm himself has disputed that claim. Nevertheless, the UnAmericans were quickly torn asunder in September, less than 2 months after their greatest triumph. Number 6. Fritz Von Eric. The next entrant in our countdown is a rare case, as he was able to accurately capture the true evil of man both in and out of the ring. Jack Adkisson was a frustrated football player whose attempts to join a pro league landed him in Edmonton, Alberta. After the CFL rejected him, Jack found himself in the Calgary dungeon of none other than Stu Hart, and a future wrestling legend was formed. Despite it being nearly 20 years since World War II, folks still hated them some Nazis, as it should be. So Jack was paired up with evil German Waldo Sieber, becoming an evil German himself, and the two were rebranded Waldo and Fritz Von Eric, a pair of grapplers still swearing allegiance to the Third Reich. Fritz leaned heavily into the character, becoming one of the most frightening heels of the late 50s and early 60s, and developed one of the most legendary finish holds in wrestling, the Iron Claw. Wanting to reduce the amount of travel in his schedule, Fritz split from Waldo, who went to the Northeast, while Fritz focused on the Midwest and the South. Fritz spent most of the 60s terrorizing the AWA in the St. Louis territory, beating Vern Gagne for the AWA World title and often getting all too close to the NWA World title, something both he and his character in the Iron Claw movie mourned and mulled over incessantly. In the late 1960s, Fritz invested in the Dallas territory, and it was here where one of the most dramatic image makeovers in wrestling occurred. In order to make himself the babyface of the territory, Fritz not only turned American, but publicly embraced Jesus as his savior, going from a German Nazi sympathizer to a redeemed red, white, and blue patriarch practically overnight. This period would spawn the legend of the Von Erich family, one of the greatest and most tragic families in the history of the business. But that's not a story for this video. Number 5. Yokozuna and Mr. Fuji. When you think about characters who had lengthy and successful runs in the WWF both before and after Vince McMahon Jr. bought the company from his father, you can't forget Mr. Fuji. He and longtime partner Professor Toru Tanaka were the company's resident Japanese heels for most of the 1970s, holding the tag team championships a then record 3 times. Fuji would come and go from the WWF a couple of times before finding more success with Mr. Saito, with whom he'd hold the tag straps 2 more times in the 80s. After slowly making his way down the card, Fuji made the switch to manager in 1985, first memorably linking with Don Morocco for some amazing vignettes, then leading Demolition to the tag team titles in the late 80s. Not bad for a guy who could barely talk, let alone wrestle. But the role Fuji was seemingly born to play fell right into his lap like a big bonsai drop in 1992. Rodney Anawai was gaining some momentum in the AWA, and in a classic example of a recasting that worked, the WWF transformed Kokina Maximus into Japanese sumo champion Yokozuna. As has been covered before on this channel, Yokozuna was a hugely successful gimmick, one of the best monster heels in company history, regardless of kayfabe or shoot heritage. Unlike the days of old, when the evil foreign menace would ultimately lose to the American hero, Yoko busted that entire trend in a single year. He won the Royal Rumble, he won at WrestleMania, he flattened Hulk Hogan, he derailed the Lex Express, he even slayed The Undertaker before finally dropping the title back to Bret Hart at WrestleMania 10, ending the longest heel reign a WWF champion had had since the days of superstar Billy Graham. For numerous reasons, Yoko's push and presentation was toned down severely in 1994 and beyond. Once we learned he could suddenly speak perfect English, the good times were over, and pretty soon both men would be gone from the company. Nevertheless, as a tandem, Yokozuna and Mr. Fuji defied the odds and became one of the most memorable foreign heel acts in WWE history. Number 4. The Sheik. He was the chief pioneer of America's hardcore wrestling history, one of wrestling's greatest heels of the 60s and 70s, who directly influenced the careers of countless wrestlers through both wrestling and promoting. Not to be confused with a certain Iron individual, it's impossible to understate the impact that the original Sheik, Ed Farhat, had on wrestling during his prime. Originally starting out as a clean-cut babyface, Farhat made a drastic change in the early 50s, transforming into the Sheik of Araby, leaning on his Lebanese heritage and portraying himself as the wealthy son of a Middle Eastern aristocrat. After battling the top stars of Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF in the late 50s and early 60s, the Sheik leaned even further into his gimmick as a deranged Muslim madman. He never spoke English in his promos, he performed pre-match prayers on a prayer rug, and used unorthodox weapons like pencils, forks, and most famously, fireballs. Unlike most heels in the territory days who jumped from place to place, the Sheik called his own shots once he invested in Detroit's big-time wrestling scene, cementing himself as the heel to beat in that territory. It was in Detroit that Sheik began his career-defining feud with his legendary rival Bobo Brazil, which carried over into most major territories throughout the 60s. With his unique presentation and his brutal tactics, the Sheik became one of the most important heels of his time, feuding with literally every major babyface of the era, even traveling to Japan where he set off several years of bloody wars with Abdul the Butcher. However, the disappointment that came with every big babyface leaving town while the heel stuck around began to catch up to big-time wrestling, and the territory hit the skids in 1980. From there, Sheik spent his final in-ring years wrestling in Japan as well as training future stars, most notably his nephew Sabu and Rob Van Dam. One of the first wrestlers to capitalize on America's growing uncertainty around the Middle East, and one of the first to normalize hardcore wrestling in the US, the Sheik bled and burned his way into the history books. Number 3. The Russians. Just think, if we didn't have the Cold War, who knows how much longer we would have been pushing Japanese people and Nazis for heel heat. The evil Russian feels like one of the industry's most time-honored staples, a single red thread in the cozy nostalgic blanket many wrestling fans have warmed themselves with. Across companies and across the decades, whether you were a Koloff, a Volkov, a Zhukov, a Kozlov, or a Malenko, or even if you were an honorary Ruski like Crusher Khrushchev or Don Kernodle, from the biggest arenas to the smallest shindies, for a time it was hard to even fathom what a wrestling show would look like without an evil Russian. And these warriors didn't just get booed, they got pushed. Ivan Koloff's greatest accomplishment, his shocking title win over the WWF champ Bruno Sammartino, snapping an 8-year run, can only be compared in modern times to Brock Lesnar beating the streak at WrestleMania. Ivan spent the rest of the 70s and much of the 80s as a hated and feared symbol of the Iron Curtain. And in 1984, he introduced his nephew, the Russian nightmare Nikita Koloff, to the scene. Yes, I know I used the wrong nickname for him the last time I talked about him. My bad. Aside from the Koloffs, perhaps the other most successful Russian gimmick in wrestling belonged to native-born Yugoslavian Nikolai Volkov. A world title contender in his own right in the 1970s, Volkov had a legendary run in the WWF as their resident Russian. In fact, one of his biggest accomplishments came when he won the Tag Team Championship at the first WrestleMania with our next entrant. Number 2. The Iron Chic. Let's be honest, Sheiky Baby and Nikolai Volkov were just two anti-American peas in a pod. They made arguably one of the greatest foreign heel acts of all time in wrestling. Who can forget that pre-match ritual of Nikolai warbling through the Russian national anthem while the Iron Sheik would say, "Iran number 1, Russia number 1, USA Haktula." Is that still a thing, by the way? Are people still talking about that? But before that tandem began, the Iron Sheik got his start training under Vern Gagne in the 1970s. The former Olympic wrestler and one-time bodyguard to the Shah Mohammed was told to adopt a gimmick similar to the original Sheik's, ultimately transforming into what became his classic look we now associate him with. Bouncing around between the Federation, Jim Crockett Promotions, and Mid-South, the Iron Sheik reached the height of his career in December of 1983 when he beat Bob Backlund to become the new WWF champion. Similar to his predecessor in Ivan Koloff, the big win was similar in shock value and that the ensuing title reign was short, as Sheiky Baby was merely a transitional champion for Hulk Hogan just weeks later, which in my opinion makes him the greatest transitional champion. Rather than chase Hogan, Chic instead engaged in the defining feud of 1984 in the company with Sergeant Slaughter, which I mentioned in our Greatest Americans video 2 weeks ago. Then when Nikolai Volkov returned to the Federation, those two were off to the races. The Axis of Evil broke hearts across America when they beat the US Express for the belts at WrestleMania 1. And even though they would lose the belts that summer, they remained one of the preeminent heel duos in the Federation for the next 2 years. The next several years of Chic's career saw him ping-pong back and forth between the WWF and just about every other company or territory around at the time, some appearances more graceful than others. But thanks to his appearances in wrestling, popular culture, and internet memes, and on social media in the years before his death, the Iron Chic remains one of the biggest go-to examples when it comes to this classic wrestling archetype. Oh, and I almost forgot, the Iron Chic was such a good foreign heel, he did it for 2 different countries. Before I give you my dastardly #1 pick, here are a few un-American, though still honorable, mentions. The Blue Bloods. Over the decades, wrestling has given flack to Pacific Islanders, Russians, Germans, Japanese people, French Canadians, and so forth. Finally, in 1995, WCW was brave enough to say, you know who else needs to be taken down a few pegs? The British. By that point, Lord Steve Regal had established himself as one of the best British wrestlers to arrive on US soil since Gentleman Chris Adams or Davey Boy Smith. A vocal anti-American character, Regal looked to form a team with a young Jean-Paul Levesque in late '94, until JP jumped ship to the WWF. After that, Regal decided to take native Alabaman Bobby Eaton under his wing and transform him into a true Englishman, My Fair Lady style. Eventually, another actual Englishman in Dave Taylor would be added to the group, making it a formidable trio of some of the best damn workers the company had at the time. La Resistance. Back in 2003, WWE looked to the Iraq War for creative inspiration, like a lot, and that's how La Resistance with Rene Dupree and Sylvain Grenier was born. Since anti-French sentiment was at an all-time high in America, with France famously staying out of the war, that meant La Res would get some of the biggest boos of the night as they waved the French and later the Quebecois flag with pride. They grew into a trio when they added the sympathizer Robert Conway, but became a tag team soon after once Dupree went down with an injury. No matter the form, the group dominated the tag division on Raw during their peak. Though their worth really hit the skids the night Batista beat Grenier and Conway in a handicap match, then somehow sodomized them both with a single flagpole. And that's while they were the champions. Rusev. If you thought Miro's run in AEW was disappointing, then try remembering how it was back when he was Alexander Rusev in WWE. A native Bulgarian who spent a long time fighting for the glory of Russia, Rusev often went back and forth between untimely injuries and all-out bad booking, most notably anything involving he and his then-wife Lana. Despite his natural charisma and his ability to seamlessly go from vicious heel to hilarious badass, Rusev only got as far as WWE wanted him to go, which is a real shame. How many other people get their own special day every day of the year? And my #1 pick for the best foreign heel in wrestling is Bret Hart. For the first several years of his career, Bret Hart's Canadian heritage was barely a blip on anyone's radar. Sure, he cut his teeth in his father's promotion at Stampede up in Alberta, but for the most part, since his debut in the World Wrestling Federation in 1984 with Jim Neidhart through his multiple world title victories in the 90s, his citizenship was barely part of the package. That all began to change, though, in late 1996. Bret took several months off after his loss at WrestleMania 12 and found himself at a crossroads. The Hitman began to explore other options, from acting to wrestling for WCW. Finally, Bret decided to stay home in the WWF, but in the 8 months he'd been gone, a lot had changed there, and that change was largely due to Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was about to further change the industry in a major way. From the 1996 Survivor Series through the 97 Rumble, these two men were at each other's throats, but by WrestleMania 13, Bret's character had become a lot less sympathetic than before, throwing tantrums over his supposed injustices, while fans couldn't get enough of Austin's wild antics. Finally, at Mania, the two men pulled off the final stroke to complete their legendary double turn that had been brewing for weeks. Bret pulled off one of the most unique turns in history. Instead of turning on the WWF fans wholesale, he only directed his ire at the American contingent, setting in motion the feud that would define the company for most of 1997 and help usher in an epic wave of business. Over the next few months, Bret would bring his family and friends together to reform the Hart Foundation, espousing his anti-American outlook, constantly insulting America and its fans while lauding the superiority of his native Canada. In doing so, it made him reviled in America but beloved up north, while American wrestlers would get the inverse treatment, a phenomenon that would lead to one of the greatest moments in WWE history, the main event of the Canadian Stampede in your house. Unfortunately, the saga of Bret Hart, Canadian hero and American scourge, wasn't long for the world. After winning the WWF title for a record-tying 5th time, he spent the next several months in near mid-card status, while whatever was going on with Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker was way more interesting. Eventually, we got the Montreal Screwjob, which emboldened an entire nation of wrestling fans for well over a decade. Despite the acrimonious way the storyline concluded, it ended up being one of the best things to happen for the company in the long run. Bret's time as an anti-American baddie may not have been for as long as others on this list, but the US-Canada feud was a huge part of what led to a massive resurgence in popularity for all of pro wrestling, and the launching of one of the sport's biggest stars in Stone Cold Steve Austin. That's why I gotta give it to the Hitman for this one, my choice for wrestling's biggest foreign heel. But who else do you think belongs on this list? Who do you think sits at the top? Let me know in the comment section below. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up if you like it, subscribe to Wrestling with Regret, hit that bell icon for all the notifications, and of course, buy the t-shirts at ProWrestlingTees.com. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.